Breaking news coming out of Washington tonight, where a significant and potentially paradigm-shifting development regarding United States military doctrine has just emerged. Moments ago, reports began circulating from high-level sources within the defense apparatus indicating a fundamental reinterpretation of the Commander-in-Chief OS authority to launch unilateral military strikes. This is not a drill, and it is not a theoretical exercise. We are looking at a pivotal moment that challenges the delicate balance between American sovereignty and international law, a development that legal scholars and geopolitical analysts have feared for decades. What we are learning is that a classified memorandum, the contents of which are now being hotly debated behind closed doors on Capitol Hill, suggests that the executive branch may be preparing to assert a broader definition of imminent threat. This redefinition would effectively grant the President of the United States the authority to bypass the United Nations Security Council, and crucially, traditional congressional oversight to authorize preemptive military action against perceived adversaries. The gravity of this situation cannot be overstated. If this doctrine is formalized, it marks a seismic departure from the post-World War II international order, raising the urgent question: are we witnessing the end of the era of collective security? The reaction has been swift and severe. Diplomatic cables are reportedly flooding into the State Department from allied capitals in Europe and Asia, seeking immediate clarification. The question echoing through the halls of the United Nations in New York is whether the United States is signaling a move toward total isolationism in its use of force. This story is developing rapidly, but what is clear right now is that the guardrails preventing a single individual from initiating a global conflict are being tested like never before. This is a developing situation, and the implications could reshape the geopolitical landscape for the next century. To understand how we arrived at this precipice, we must step back from the frenzy of the current news cycle and look at the slow, steady erosion of constraints that has led us here. This did not happen overnight. This is not the result of a single administration or a sudden impulse. It is the culmination of a decades-long expansion of executive power that has quietly transformed the American presidency into an office with the singular, terrifying capacity to wage war on its own terms. For years, the American public has viewed military action through the lens of necessary defense, but the narrative is shifting. We are no longer talking about responding to an attack. We are talking about the right to strike first, without permission and without consensus. The core of this crisis lies in the friction between two massive legal frameworks: the United States Constitution and the United Nations Charter. Under international law, specifically Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, member states are prohibited from using force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The only exceptions are self-defense or action authorized by the Security Council. However, the American perspective has always been complicated by the concept of American exceptionalism and the President's Article 2 powers as Commander-in-Chief. What we are seeing tonight is the potential for those Article 2 powers to completely eclipse international obligations. This brings us to the scenario that keeps national security advisors awake at night. Imagine a situation where intelligence suggests a threat is building, not an active attack, but a potential one. Under the traditional interpretation of international law, the path is clear: diplomacy first, sanctions second, and military action only as a last resort, ideally with a coalition. But under the doctrine being discussed right now, the timeline collapses. The president could argue that the mere existence of a capability in a hostile nation constitutes an imminent threat, justifying a unilateral strike. This removes the check from the checks and balances system. The danger of unilateralism is not just legal, it is operational and strategic. When the United States acts alone, it owns the aftermath alone. We have seen this play out in history, but never on the scale that modern technology now permits. The concern among veteran military strategists is that stripping away the requirement for international consensus removes the cooling-off period, the critical time window where cooler heads can prevail. Without that pause, the slide from a localized strike to a regional conflagration becomes a slippery slope that is almost impossible to climb back up. Consider the atmosphere inside the Situation Room during such a crisis. It is a room designed for decisiveness, not debate. When the doors close and the monitors flicker to life with satellite imagery and real-time intelligence, the pressure on the president is unimaginable. If the legal advice provided to the president states that international law is secondary to U.S. security interests, the moral weight of the decision shifts. The constraint of, is this legal, is replaced by, can we do this? And in the world of the U.S. military, the answer to can we is almost always yes. The capability exists. The question is whether the conscience of the nation and the laws of the world can hold it back. We must also look at the precedent this sets for the rest of the world. This is the argument being made by critics tonight. If the United States, the architect of the modern international legal system, decides that it is no longer bound by these rules, what stops other nations from doing the same? If Washington asserts the right to strike unilaterally based on its own definition of a threat, then Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran are handed a blank check to do the same in their spheres of influence. The fabric of international law is held together largely by the belief that the great powers will adhere to it. If that belief shatters, we return to a world where might makes right, a state of anarchy that the United Nations was specifically created to prevent. The silence from the White House regarding the specifics of this new legal interpretation is deafening. Usually, when a shift of this magnitude occurs, there is a rollout, a speech, a white paper, a press conference. The fact that this information is leaking out in fragments suggests an internal struggle. It implies that there are those within the administration who understand the catastrophic risks of unbridled unilateralism and are trying to pump the brakes. But, as of this hour, the momentum appears to be on the side of expansion, pushing the boundaries of what a president can do in the name of national security. Let's talk about the human element, because in discussions about doctrine and executive orders, we often lose sight of the reality on the ground. Unilateral military action is rarely surgical. The term surgical strike is a comforting myth used to sell the necessity of violence to a domestic audience. In reality, when a superpower unleashes its arsenal without the oversight of a coalition or the mandate of international law, the threshold for collateral damage often shifts. Without the scrutiny of allies, the rules of engagement can loosen. The tragedy of unilateral action is that it often breeds the very enemies it seeks to destroy, creating a cycle of vengeance that outlasts the presidency that initiated it. Furthermore, we have to consider the intelligence aspect. History is littered with examples of imminent threats that turned out to be intelligence failures. The specter of the 2003 invasion of Iraq looms large over this entire conversation. That was a war predicated on intelligence that was later proven to be flawed, yet it was conducted with a coalition of the willing. Now, imagine a similar scenario, but without the coalition, without the external intelligence agencies of allied nations reviewing the data and asking the hard questions. Unilateralism creates an echo chamber. When you cut out the international community, you cut out the dissenting voices that might save you from a catastrophic error. The role of Congress in this equation is currently the subject of intense scrutiny. The Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war, but that power has atrophied over the last 70 years. The War Powers Resolution was intended to check the president, but every president since Nixon has viewed it as unconstitutional. If this new doctrine takes hold, Congress may find itself completely sidelined, reduced to a spectator body that funds wars it did not authorize. We are seeing senators from both sides of the aisle expressing deep concern tonight, not just about the legality, but about the constitutional crisis this represents. If the president can ignore international law abroad, does that embolden the executive branch to ignore limits at home? As we continue to monitor this breaking story, we are waiting for a response from the Department of Justice. The Office of Legal Counsel is the entity responsible for drafting the memos that justify these actions. These memos are often kept secret for years, known only to a select few. The American public is essentially in the dark about the legal theories that are being used to justify actions taken in their name. This lack of transparency is a critical part of the problem. A democracy cannot function if its citizens do not know the rules by which their government wages war. The economic implications are also beginning to ripple through the markets. Uncertainty is the enemy of stability. If the world believes the U.S. is becoming a rogue actor, unpredictable and unbound by law, markets react. We are already seeing jittery movement in the energy sector and defense stocks. But beyond the ticker tape, the real economic risk is sanctions. It seems unthinkable that allies would sanction the United States. But if a unilateral action violates the sovereignty of a nation protected by treaties, European and Asian partners may have no choice but to distance themselves economically. The dollar's dominance is partly based on trust in American stability. Unilateral military adventurism erodes that trust faster than any economic policy ever could. We are standing at a crossroads. One path leads to a reaffirmed commitment to the international order, messy and slow as it may be. The other path leads to a world of swift, decisive, and potentially disastrous unilateralism. The decision rests in the Oval Office, but the consequences belong to all of us. As the night unfolds, we expect more details to emerge about the specific triggers that would activate this new doctrine. Would it apply to cyber warfare? Would it apply to non-state actors in sovereign countries? The ambiguity is part of the strategy, but it is also part of the danger. The implications of this doctrinal shift extend far beyond the sterile corridors of Washington legal offices. They reach directly into the cockpits of fighter jets and the command centers of drone operations. We must consider the burden this places on the men and women in uniform. The American soldier is sworn to obey lawful orders, a phrase that carries immense weight under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If a president orders a unilateral strike that the rest of the world deems a war crime or a violation of international sovereignty, The pilots and operators pulling the trigger are placed in an impossible legal and moral bind. We are entering a gray zone where the shield of sovereign immunity may no longer protect individual service members from the reach of international tribunals. The psychological toll of waging a war that the world calls illegal is a burden no administration should lightly place on its troops. Furthermore, the logistical reality of modern warfare makes true unilateralism almost a myth. Even if the United States decides to act alone politically, it rarely fights alone geographically. American power projection relies on a vast network of bases, airspace rights, and logistical hubs hosting in allied nations: Germany, Japan, Qatar, the United Kingdom. If the U.S. initiates a conflict that violates international law, these host nations face their own legal crises. They could be considered complicit in an act of aggression. We could see a scenario where allies deny the U.S. use of their airspace or shut down supply lines to distance themselves from a rogue operation. This is the strategic nightmare. A U.S. president orders a strike, but the global infrastructure required to execute it begins to shut down, leaving American forces exposed and isolated. This isolation brings us to the erosion of soft power, a currency the United States has traded on since the Marshall Plan. Legitimacy is a force multiplier. When the U.S. acts with the backing of the UN or NATO, it brings moral authority that intimidates adversaries and reassures neutrals. Stripping away that legitimacy changes the nature of the victory. A unilateral military victory can easily turn into a long-term diplomatic defeat. We have seen this in the past, where the tactical success of toppling a regime is overshadowed by the insurgency and instability that follows when the local population views the intervention as an illegitimate occupation rather than a sanctioned liberation. The narrative matters, and in the information age, the narrative is written by who follows the rules. There is also a terrifying technological dimension to this story that cannot be ignored. As the timeline for decision-making shrinks, we are seeing the integration of artificial intelligence into threat assessment. If we combine a doctrine of preemptive unilateral action with AI systems designed to predict threats before they happen, we risk creating a feedback loop of paranoia. Imagine an algorithm flagging a 75% probability of an adversarial launch. Under strict international law, you wait for verifiable proof. Under a loosened unilateral doctrine, the president might feel compelled to strike based on a probability curve. We are moving toward a minority report style of geopolitics, where wars are fought to prevent crimes that haven't occurred yet, based on data the public never sees. Domestically, this sparks a constitutional showdown that the Supreme Court has historically tried to avoid. The political question doctrine has often kept the courts out of foreign policy disputes, but a brazen violation of international treaties, which under the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, might force the judiciary's hand. We could witness a paralyzed government where the president orders the military to act, while Congress attempts to cut funding and the courts debate the legality of the order. This internal division is exactly what America's adversaries hope for. A divided superpower is a distracted superpower, and while Washington argues with itself, the rest of the world moves on. The precedent of the Nuremberg trials established that Folkuiro, following orders, is not a defense for committing war crimes. This is a lesson etched in history, yet it seems to be fading from the institutional memory. If the United States, the prosecutor at Nuremberg, begins to act in ways that mirror the aggression it once condemned, the moral architecture of the post-war world collapses. We are talking about the normalization of aggression. If the U.S. strikes a sovereign nation today because of a potential threat, what argument can be made when another nuclear power does the same tomorrow? The rule of law is a fragile pact. It only works if the strongest player agrees to be bound by it. As we near the end of this broadcast, the silence from the White House remains the loudest part of this story. The absence of a denial suggests that the debate is real and the policy is being drafted. We are witnessing the expansion of the imperial presidency, a concept warned about by historians for half a century. The checks and balances designed by the Founding Fathers were meant to slow down the rush to war, to force deliberation, to ensure that sending Americans into harm's way was a collective decision of the people's representatives. Unilateralism bypasses the people. It turns the war power into a personal prerogative of the executive. We must understand that international law is not just a set of abstract rules for diplomats to argue over in Geneva. It is the safety valve for human civilization. It is the mechanism we invented to stop the cycle of endless war. It is the promise that might does not automatically equal right. When a superpower decides that it is above the law, it doesn't just break a rule, it breaks the trust that holds the global community together. The risk isn't just a botched military operation. The risk is a return to a dark age of geopolitics where the only law is the law of the jungle. In the coming days, we will see pundits arguing the nuances of Article 2 in the War Powers Act. We will hear talk of national interests and strategic necessity. But beneath the jargon, the core question is simple and terrifyingly urgent. Who controls the sword of the American empire? Is it the law, or is it the will of one man? If the answer shifts to the latter, we have crossed a threshold from which there may be no return. The world is watching. History is taking notes. And for the first time in a long time, the future feels less like a promise and more like a warning. This is a story that is far from over. In fact, for the citizens of the world who rely on stability, the anxiety is just beginning. We will remain on this story, pressing for answers, demanding transparency, and reminding those in power that authority without accountability is tyranny. From Washington, this has been a special report on the shifting sands of American military doctrine. Good night and good luck.